If you believe there is no force on earth more powerful than a mother's will to protect her children, and that a man who betrays his own family will inevitably face a reckoning, then you need to hear this story. Make sure you subscribe and hit the like button, because the ending is something you will never forget. NTHE silence was the first sign of war. Not a peaceful silence, but a heavy, suffocating blanket of disapproval that had fallen over our home. It was broken only by the 9 tiny, whimpering sounds coming from the row of bassinets that filled our living room. 9 perfect, beautiful baby girls. My daughters, our daughters, and they were hungry. I was sitting on the floor, my body a wreck of exhaustion and pain from the birth just 3 days prior. My own hunger was a dull ache, a distant signal from a body I no longer recognized. Every ounce of my being was focused on the 9 tiny mouths that depended on me for everything. My milk was coming in, but it wasn't enough. Not for 9. The doctor had been clear. They needed to be supplemented with formula immediately, or they would risk dehydration, failure to thrive, even death. NTHE formula, cases of it, sat on the kitchen counter. A mountain of life-saving powder, paid for by the donations of our small, generous community who had celebrated the news of our non-uplets. But it might as well have been on the moon. Because my husband John was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, his arms crossed, his body a physical barrier between our starving children and the food they needed to survive. "And John, please," I begged, my voice cracking. "They're crying. They're hungry. Just let me feed them." NHE looked from me, to the row of bassinets, and then back to me. His face, the face I had loved for a decade, was a mask of cold, hard resentment. "I told you, Maria," he said, his voice chillingly calm. "I'm not spending a dime on them. Not one. It's not your money," I cried, gesturing wildly. "The town donated it. For them. For the babies, the town donated it because they thought I was having a family." He spat, the word family dripping with venom. "Not a litter. 9 more girls. Do you know what they're saying about me at the mill? They're laughing. The man who can only make girls. My father, my own father, hasn't spoken to me since they were born. This isn't about you or your pride," I screamed, my voice raw. "This is about them. They will die, John. Do you understand me? They will die if we don't feed them." NHE took a step forward, his shadow falling over me and the nearest bassinet. He looked down at the tiny, red-faced baby, her fist flailing weakly. There was no love in his eyes, no compassion, only disgust and, "Maybe that's for the best," he whispered, the words so monstrous, so utterly devoid of humanity, that the air left my lungs. "Maybe it's better to cut our losses now." NHE turned his back on me, on his 9 starving daughters, and walked out of the room. I heard the front door open and slam shut. He was gone. He had left us. He had sentenced his own children to starve to death, his pride more important than their lives. And I looked at the 9 innocent faces, their cries growing weaker, more desperate. The world narrowed to a single, terrifying reality. There was no one coming to help. There was no we, her. There was only me. My body was their only hope. My milk, as insufficient as it was the only thing standing between them and the fate their father had just wished upon them. And in that moment, a fire ignited in my soul, a rage so fierce it burned away the pain and the exhaustion. He had made his choice. Now I had to make mine. I would not let my daughters die. I would become whatever I had to be to keep them alive. And I made a vow to my 9 little girls, a silent, sacred promise. I will save you. And I will make him pay for this. I will make him pay for every tear you cry, for every pang of hunger you feel. The war had begun. And our life wasn't supposed to be a tragedy. It was supposed to be a simple, hard-working love story. I met John when I was 18. He was strong, quiet, and dependable, a man who worked with his hands at the local lumber mill, just like his father and his grandfather before him. I was a waitress at the town diner, saving up for community college. He had a slow smile that made my heart flutter and a steadiness that felt like coming home. NHE came from a family where tradition was everything. The Miller men were pillars of our small town of Oakhaven. They were rough, proud men who valued two things above all else: hard work and sons to carry on the family name. John's father, Old Man Miller, was a formidable patriarch who ruled his family with an iron fist and a deep-seated belief in the proper order of things. Men worked, men provided, and men had sons. When John asked me to marry him, my own parents were thrilled. "He's a good man, Maria," my father had said. "He'll take care of you." And I believed it. I loved him. I loved his quiet strength and the way he made me feel safe. I saw his desire for a son not as a flaw, but as a part of who he was, a deep-rooted need to live up to his family's expectations. NWE bought a small house on Hope Street, a fixer-upper that we poured our sweat and savings into. Those first few years were happy. We worked hard, we saved, and we dreamed of the family we would build. The dream always included a son. Our boy, John would call him. He'll be out there in the woods with me, learning the trade as soon as he can walk. Then our first daughter, Sarah, was born. I was overjoyed, instantly in love with her perfect little face. John was quiet. He held her, but it was with a sense of duty, not the unbridled joy I had expected. "A girl," his father had grunted when he saw her, before turning and walking away. The disappointment was a tangible cloud that settled over our home. NTWO years later, our second daughter, Emily, was born. The cloud grew darker. John started spending more time at the bar with his friends after his shift, coming home late, smelling of beer and resentment. The silence in our house grew heavier. He was a good provider, I told myself. He never raised his voice or his hand, but his love felt conditional, his approval always just out of reach. When I became pregnant for the third time, the pressure was immense. "It has to be a boy this time, Maria," he'd say, his voice tight. "I can't face my father if it's another girl." When our third daughter, Jessica, was born, something inside John seemed to break. He stopped talking about having more children. He retreated into himself, a silent, brooding presence in the house. Our marriage became a fragile truce, held together by our shared history, and my desperate hope that he would one day learn to love the beautiful family we had. Years passed. Our girls grew, and they were wonderful, bright, funny, and kind. But to John, they were a constant reminder of his failure. He treated them with a detached sense of obligation, providing for their needs, but withholding his affection. Then, when I was 35, I discovered I was pregnant again. It was a surprise, unplanned, and, for me, terrifying. I couldn't bear the thought of putting another daughter through the silent rejection of her father. But this pregnancy was different. I was sicker, more tired, and growing larger, much faster than before. An early ultrasound revealed the shocking truth. "Mrs. Miller," the doctor said, his eyes wide as he stared at the screen. I've never seen this before. You're carrying non-uplets, 9 babies." The number was so staggering it felt unreal. I almost fainted. But then the doctor delivered the second blow. "And from what we can see," he said gently, "the chromosomal markers are all consistent. They all appear to be female. 9 more daughters." My blood ran cold. This wouldn't just be a disappointment for John. This would be an apocalypse. In that moment, I made a fateful decision. I told him I was pregnant with non-uplets, a medical marvel that instantly made us local celebrities. But I withheld the gender. I let him live in the impossible hope that among the 9, there would be at least one boy. His hope was the only thing keeping his simmering rage from boiling over. NTHE Town rallied around us. Donations poured in. The mill promised John his job would be safe. Our little house on Hope Street was filled with gifts: cribs, clothes, diapers, and cases upon cases of formula. John played the part of the proud, overwhelmed father-to-be. He smiled for the local news cameras, accepted pats on the back, and basked in the attention. But at night, the mask would slip. "There has to be a boy in there, Maria," he would whisper, his voice a low threat. After all this, there has to be. NTHE birth was a scheduled C-section, a carefully orchestrated medical event involving a team of dozens of doctors and nurses. One by one, my daughters were brought into the world. 1 girl. 2 girls. 3. With each announcement, I could see the hope in John's eyes flicker and die, replaced by a cold, terrifying fury. By the time the 9th and final daughter was born, his face was like stone. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at his children. He simply turned and walked out of the operating room. NHE didn't visit me or the babies in the hospital. He didn't answer my calls. When I was discharged 3 days later, my brother had to drive me home. I walked into our house, my body aching, my heart filled with dread. John was there, sitting in the living room, surrounded by the 9 bassinets. He looked at me, his eyes empty of all emotion. And that's when he laid down his monstrous ultimatum. He would not help. He would not provide. He would not even allow me to use the donated supplies to feed our children. He was washing his hands of us. He had been publicly humiliated, and we were his punishment. As he slammed the door and left me in the silent, whimpering house, I finally understood. He didn't just resent his daughters. He hated them. And he was willing to let them die to soothe his wounded pride. NNFOR the first few hours after John left, I was paralyzed by panic. The cries of my 9 hungry babies were a symphony of terror. My own body felt like a battlefield. The pain from my incision was sharp and constant, and the overwhelming fatigue was a physical weight. I tried to nurse them, moving from one to the next in a desperate, heartbreaking rotation. But I was 1 woman, and they were 9. It wasn't enough. Their cries grew weaker, their tiny bodies becoming lethargic. And I looked at the phone, my hand trembling. I could call 911. They would come, take the babies, and they would be saved. But what then? They would be placed in the system, separated and scattered. John would win. He would be free of his burden. The thought of my daughters being raised by strangers, of our family being shattered before it even had a chance, was unbearable. It was a fate I refused to accept. NMY eyes fell on the cases of formula again. His words echoed in my head. Maybe that's for the best. A primal rage surged through me, so powerful it eclipsed my fear. I would not let him have this victory. I would not let my daughters become a statistic. With a surge of adrenaline, I got to my feet. I walked into the kitchen and ripped open a can of formula. My hand shook so badly I could barely scoop the powder, but I managed to make a bottle. Then another, and another. I went back to the living room and began to feed my children. The sight of them latching onto the bottles, their tiny bodies relaxing as their hunger was finally sated, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I fed them all, one by one, until a peaceful silence finally fell over the room. They were safe. For now, NBUT, I knew this was just the first battle. John would be back, and his rage would be even greater when he discovered my defiance. I needed allies. I needed a plan. NMY first call was to my older brother, Michael. He was a truck driver, a tough but gentle man who had always been my protector. I told him everything, my voice a choked whisper. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Then I heard him swear, a low, vicious sound. "I'm on my way," he said. "Lock the doors. Don't you open them for anyone. I'll be there in 4 hours." NMY's second call was to the one person in town I knew I could trust implicitly, Mrs. Gable, the retired nurse who ran the church's charity outreach. She was a widow in her 70s, a woman with a spine of steel and a heart of gold. She had organized the donation drive for us. I told her the truth, the ugly, monstrous truth of what John had done. NHER reaction was not shock, but a quiet, simmering fury. "That man," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "That man is his father's son. I should have known. Maria, you listen to me. You are not alone in this. The women of this town, we look after our own." Within an hour, Mrs. Gable was at my door, along with 2 other women from the church. They didn't come with platitudes or pity. They came with casseroles, groceries, and a fierce, protective energy that felt like a shield. They took one look at my exhausted face and the 9 sleeping babies and sprang into action. One woman started cleaning the kitchen, another did laundry, while Mrs. Gable checked on each baby, her experienced hands gentle and sure. "You need to rest, child," she told me, steering me toward the bedroom. "We'll set up a feeding and changing schedule. We will be your army." When my brother Michael arrived, he found a house transformed. It was no longer a place of fear and desperation, but a command center, run by a small but formidable group of women. He walked in, his large frame filling the doorway, and his eyes softened as he took in the scene. He hugged me tightly, his embrace a promise of safety. "I'm moving the rest of your things out of the master bedroom," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You and the girls will take that room. It's the biggest. I'm sleeping on the couch. He's not setting foot in this house again. I'll make sure of it." NTHAT night, as I lay in bed, listening to the quiet sounds of my new army tending to my children in the other room, I cried for the first time. Not tears of fear, but tears of overwhelming gratitude. John had thought he could isolate me, that he could break me by leaving me alone with an impossible task. He had underestimated me, and he had underestimated the quiet power of the women in our town, the warriors who showed up when one of their own was in peril. The house on Hope Street was no longer a prison. It had become a fortress, and we were ready for the siege. In NTHE next morning, the war began in earnest. John returned, as I knew he would. He didn't come alone. He brought his father. Old Man Miller, with his thunderous expression and imposing presence, looked like he had come to crush a rebellion. NMY brother Michael met them on the porch. I watched from the window, my heart pounding. "You need to leave, John," Michael said, his voice calm but unyielding. He stood with his arms crossed, blocking the doorway. "This is my house, Mike," John snarled. "Get out of my way. Not while you're threatening your wife and children." "It's not," Michael replied. Old Man Miller stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "Your sister is a disgrace," he boomed, his voice echoing down the quiet street. "She shamed my son, shamed our family. We are here to put an end to this nonsense." Just then, Mrs. Gable opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She was half the size of Old Man Miller, but she faced him without a flicker of fear. "Henry Miller," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "I have known you for 50 years, and I have never seen a more shameful display. You stand here, a grandfather, and you condone your son's attempt to starve 9 innocent babies? Has your pride rotted your soul completely?" And a few neighbors had started to drift out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. They stood on their lawns, watching. The public shaming seemed to momentarily stun the 2 men. "This is a family matter," John stammered, his bravado faltering under Mrs. Gable's steely gaze. "It stopped being a family matter when you abandoned your family," she retorted. "Now, I suggest you both leave before I call Sheriff Brody and explain to him that you are here to harass a recovering mother and her 9 newborn children. I'm sure he'd be very interested to hear your side of the story." Defeated for the moment, John and his father retreated, muttering threats as they stomped back to their truck. It was a small victory, but we all knew it was just the beginning. NTHE's siege of Hope Street lasted for weeks. John and his family used every weapon they had to try and break us. They started a vicious smear campaign in town. They told people I was unstable, that I was suffering from postpartum psychosis, that I had driven John away with my hysteria. They claimed the women helping me were busybodies who were interfering in a private matter. They tried to cut off our supplies. John's father owned the only grocery store in Oak Haven, and he refused to sell to me or any of the women who were helping. They tried to intimidate my brother, with John's father threatening to call the mill owner and have him fired from his job. NBUT, they underestimated the strength of our fortress. The community, led by Mrs. Gable's army, fought back. When the local grocery store refused us service, women from our church organized trips to the next town over, returning with carloads of supplies. When the whispers and gossips started, Mrs. Gable and her friends met them head-on in the aisles of the post office and the pews of the church. correcting the lies with the cold, hard truth. He left her to starve his own children, they would say, their voices ringing with conviction. What kind of man does that? Sheriff Brody, a good man who had known me since I was a child, paid us a wellness check visit. He saw the clean house, the well-cared-for babies, and the organized schedule of volunteers. He then paid a visit to John and his father and warned them that any further harassment would result in charges. NTHE financial pressure was the hardest. John had emptied our joint bank account, leaving me with nothing. The daily cost of caring for 9 infants was astronomical. The donated formula would not last forever. Just when I was beginning to despair, another miracle occurred. A young reporter from a regional newspaper got wind of the story, not John's version, but ours. The story of the Warriors of Hope Street, the army of women protecting a mother and her 9 daughters from a cruel husband and his powerful family. NTHE story was picked up by national news outlets. It went viral. Our small town was suddenly in the spotlight. Donations began to pour in, not just from our community, but from all over the country. People sent money, clothes, diapers, and a year's supply of formula. A lawyer from a big city firm offered to represent me pro bono in my divorce and custody case. NTHE tide had turned. John's attempt to isolate and break me had backfired spectacularly. He had wanted to make me a pariah, but instead, he had made me a symbol of maternal strength. He had tried to use his family's power to crush me, but he had ignited a firestorm of public support that was far more powerful than his father's influence in our small town. The siege was failing, and from the safety of my fortress, surrounded by my daughters and my army, I began to plan my counterattack. An NTHE lawyer who contacted me, a sharp, compassionate woman named Eleanor Vance, was a force of nature. She flew into Oakhaven and met with me at my kitchen table, the sounds of my 9 cooing daughters in the background. She listened to my story, her expression growing more determined with every word. "This isn't just a divorce, Maria," she said, her voice firm. "This is a clear case of child endangerment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and financial abuse. We are not just going to file for custody. We are going to sue him for everything he has and everything he ever will have." Eleanor's strategy was brilliant and aggressive. First, she secured an emergency court order granting me sole custody of the children and exclusive use of the house. The order also stipulated that John was to have no contact with me or the girls. Sheriff Brody served the papers to John at the lumber mill in front of all his coworkers. The public humiliation was a taste of his own medicine. Next, Eleanor's team of forensic accountants began digging into the Miller family's finances. They discovered that John's father had been systematically hiding assets for years, preparing to pass the family business and properties to John tax-free. They had created a web of trusts and LLCs designed to protect their wealth. NTHE divorce proceedings were brutal. John, represented by a local lawyer paid for by his father, tried to argue that he was the victim. He claimed I was mentally unstable and that he had left for his own safety. He even tried to claim that he should not have to pay child support for 9 children, as the pregnancy was a freak of nature and not his fault. NBUT Eleanor was ready for him. She presented the testimony of Mrs. Gable and the other women, who detailed his cruelty and neglect. She presented the bank statements showing he had drained our accounts. She presented the threatening voicemails he had left for my brother. NTHE, turning point of the case, however, was a piece of evidence I hadn't even known we had. One of the younger women who had been helping us, a tech-savvy college student, had set up a small security camera on the front porch after the first confrontation. The camera had recorded the entire exchange, including Old Man Miller's tirade and Mrs. Gable's calm, steely response. But it had also recorded something else. As John and his father were stomping away, the camera's microphone picked up their conversation. "Don't worry, son," Old Man Miller's voice snarled on the recording. "We'll starve them out. She won't last a month. Then you can take the house and she can take her litter to the state." When Eleanor played that recording in the courtroom, a collective gasp went through the gallery. It was undeniable proof of their malicious intent. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, looked at John and his father with utter contempt. NTHE judgment was a complete and total victory. I was awarded full and sole custody of my 9 daughters. John was ordered to pay a staggering amount in child support, calculated to ensure his daughters would be well cared for until they were adults. To ensure he paid, the judge placed a lien on his future inheritance and a portion of the lumber mill's profits. His father was found in contempt of court for his role in the conspiracy and fined heavily. They were financially ruined. The wealth they had hoarded and protected for generations was now legally bound to the 9 little girls they had despised and tried to destroy. And I walked out of the courthouse that day into the arms of my brother and my army of women. I felt a profound sense of justice, not for me, but for my daughters. We had faced down the monster, and we had won. The news of the verdict spread through Oak Haven like wildfire. The Miller family's reign of influence was over. Old Man Miller sold the grocery store and became a recluse. John lost his job at the mill. The other men, many of them fathers themselves, would no longer work alongside him. He became a ghost in his own town, a pariah, haunted by the consequences of his own cruelty. The reckoning was complete. Then, life after, the reckoning was a beautiful, chaotic symphony. Our house on Hope Street, once a fortress, became a haven. It was filled with the sounds of 9 little girls learning to crawl, then to walk, then to talk. It was a whirlwind of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and endless laundry, and it was the most wonderful life I could have ever imagined. With the financial security from the settlement, I was able to give my daughters everything they needed. But I was determined to give them something more important than material things, a life free from the shadow of their father's bitterness. I wanted to raise them to be strong, compassionate, and confident women who knew their worth was not determined by any man's approval. NMY Army of Warriors remained by my side. Mrs. Gable became a surrogate grandmother to my girls, her wisdom and love a constant presence in our home. My brother Michael was their adoring uncle, teaching them how to climb trees and throw a ball. The women of Oak Haven, who had fought for us, became our extended family. We were a testament to the idea that it truly does take a village to raise a child, or in my case, 9 of them. And as the girls grew, their individual personalities blossomed. There was Anna, the natural leader, Bella, the quiet artist, Clara, the budding scientist, Daisy, the fearless athlete, and on, each one a unique and precious flower in the garden I was tending. I nurtured their passions, celebrated their achievements, and taught them to support and love one another fiercely. They were not a litter, they were a sisterhood, a powerful and unbreakable unit. And I went back to school online and got a degree in early childhood education. I opened a small, nonprofit daycare center in Oak Haven, dedicated to providing affordable, high-quality care for the families in our town. It was my way of giving back to the community that had saved us. The daycare was called The Sisterhood, and its motto was, "Strength in Numbers," and I never remarried. My life was full, my heart overflowing with the love of my daughters and my community. I had found a deeper, more profound partnership in the sisterhood of women who had stood by me. Years passed. My girls grew into remarkable young women. They excelled in school, in sports, in the arts. They were kind, intelligent, and resilient. They knew their story, the story of their father's rejection and their mother's fight. But it was not a source of shame. It was a source of strength, a testament to their own survival and the love that had protected them. And one day, when the girls were teenagers, a letter arrived. It was from a prison chaplain in another state. John, after years of drifting in menial jobs, had been incarcerated for assault. He was, the chaplain wrote, a broken and dying man, filled with regret. He was asking to see his daughters. I sat my 9 girls down in the living room, the same room where I had once fed them in desperation, and I read them the letter. I told them the choice was theirs and theirs alone. I would support whatever they decided. They talked amongst themselves for a long time. Finally, Anna, my eldest, spoke for all of them. "We don't need to see him," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Our family is here, in this room. We don't hate him. We don't feel anything for him at all. He's a stranger, and we have everything we need." NHER sisters nodded in agreement. There was no anger in their faces, no pain, only a quiet, resolute peace. In that moment, I knew I had succeeded. I had not just saved their lives, I had given them a life so full of love that there was no room for their father's poison to take root. He had not broken them. He had, in the end, made them stronger. An NTHE final chapter of John's story came not with a bang, but with a quiet notice of his death in prison a few months later. We marked his passing not with mourning, but with a quiet moment of reflection on the life we had built in his absence. His legacy was one of bitterness and ruin. My legacy was sitting around me, vibrant and full of promise. Decades flew by. My daughters grew up and went out into the world, a formidable force of 9 strong, educated women. They became doctors, lawyers, teachers, artists, and mothers themselves. They remained fiercely close, an unbreakable clan connected by blood and history. Our house on Hope Street became the family headquarters, the place they all returned for holidays, bringing their own children to play in the yard where they had grown up. And I became a grandmother many times over. My life was a rich tapestry of family, laughter, and love. The daycare I started became a beloved town institution, run by one of my own daughters. The story of the Warriors of Hope Street became a local legend, a tale told to inspire new generations. One sunny afternoon, I was sitting on my porch, an old woman with silver hair and a happy heart. I was watching my granddaughters play, a new generation of strong girls. One of my daughters, Clara the scientist, sat down beside me. "I was thinking about him today," she said quietly. "Dad?" And I looked at her, surprised. It had been years since any of them had mentioned him. "I was reading a study on epigenetics," she continued, "about how trauma can be passed down through generations. And I realized something. His legacy wasn't just hate and pride. In a way, his cruelty was the catalyst for our strength. His rejection forced you to become a warrior. It forced us to become a sisterhood. It created this." She gestured to the sprawling, laughing family before us. "All of this love, all of this strength, it was born from that one terrible act. He tried to create a void, and instead, he created a universe. And I looked at the faces of my children and my children's children. I saw the kindness, the intelligence, the resilience. I saw the unbreakable bond of family. And I understood what she meant. John had tried to erase his daughters from his life, to sentence them to oblivion because they were not the sons he craved. But he had failed. From the ashes of his hatred, I had raised a garden of girls. And they had grown so strong, so vibrant, so full of life, that their roots had broken the foundations of his bitter world and created a new one, built on the simple, unshakable foundation of a mother's love. The house on Hope Street had lived up to its name. It had become a legacy of hope, not just for my family, but for everyone who heard our story. And it was a legacy that would last for generations.